I'm standing by the River Thames, and behind me is Hampton Court, a building that pictures the excesses of the age in which it was built. It was built by Cardinal Wolsey back at the time of the Reformation. And at that time, when it was completed, it was the largest building that was in the British Empire. It has 1,000 rooms. It took 2,500 workmen to be able to put it together. It takes 500 people to be able to keep it. It had 250 tons of lead pipe that brought special water into it, and that was an unheard of thing in that day. But it was in the same place on Monday, on January the 6th in 1604, that James I, the new King of England, had been meeting with 50 to 60 prelates, trying to resolve problems that were in the church at that time. They knew King James would want a new translation. But that's not the first translation of the Bible into English. For that, we've got to go back 230 years. This church is located in Lutterworth in England. It's only a village, but it's 700 years of age. Back in 1374, Dr. John Wycliffe, who was the president of the Balliol College in Oxford, became the pastor of this church. John Wycliffe made such an impression that he left his influence on generations to come. Many things may have caused that influence, but one is notable. He gave us, for the first time we ever had one, a Bible in English. That Bible wasn't taken from the Greek or the Hebrew because nobody in England knew Greek or Hebrew. Latin was the religious language of that day, and he just simply translated from Latin, but into the language that common people would understand. And then he gave that Bible to his Lollard preachers, and he sent them out to teach the people in the marketplaces and in the fields what it meant to have a message from God in the Bible. Significant thing about the Bible was that it was handwritten. It took 10 months to make one copy. And for one copy, it would cost £40 to be able to buy it. Now, £40 then is not what it is today. They must have written so many of these that they were spread all over the country, burned wherever they were found, and yet, today there's 170 copies still surviving. There were so many of John Wycliffe's preacher boys who gave their lives for their faith that over in the city of Norwich, for example, they called the place of public execution the Lollards Pit. But they didn't get the courage to take up the body of John Wycliffe for 44 years. Then they took it out of its grave and they burned the bones to ashes, and they took the ashes and they emptied them here into the River Swift. They were intending that they would close the door on his influence. But look what they really symbolically did. This River Swift flows into the Avon. The Avon flows into the Severn. The Severn flows into the Bristol Channel, and the Bristol Channel empties out into the oceans of the world. In fact, symbolically, they opened the doors and let his influence out. In the 100 years that followed the death of Wycliffe, there were two momentous events that occurred. The first of these was the fall of Constantinople. When it fell, Greek culture started moving toward the west, and people in Europe began to learn a Greek language. In universities all over Europe, they started majoring, specializing in the teaching and learning of Greek. The second major event that happened the following year. It was the invention of the Gutenberg press with movable print. When that occurred, they began to have the ability to print things they had not been previously able to do, and the first thing that they printed was a Latin Bible. Of course, it brought freedom, but not freedom for everybody. The limited freedom that it brought was in the academic world, but they were still committed in the religious world that there would be no Bible in the vernacular of the people. They were not going to allow a Bible to be printed in English, since in 1407 they had passed a law forbidding it, and they were not going to rescind that law. That makes this famous Tower of London which is just behind me here, not so famous in that day. It was infamous because its rooms were filled with people. Many of them were burned to death, and where they were burned is only about 2 miles away from here in a place called Smithfield. It was right here in this area where they put the stakes and then they built the timber around the stakes. They would bring the person and chain them to the stake and then ignite the timber. And their flesh would literally burn until they died. Those dear people died in order that you and I might have an English Bible in our hands. You can't help but being emotional standing on a spot where these things occurred, because I think of all the good people that died here, men like John Lambert. Because Lambert, if you remember, is the man when the flames came up over his head, in order to try and communicate with the people in an area that then was wide open fields and thousands of people were here. He put his hands as high he could put them and projected his fingers. Flames came from his fingers while he cried, "None but Christ, none but Christ." For example, on April the 4th in 1519, in a place called Little Park in Coventry, not very many miles from here, there were 6 working men. 3 of them were just shoemakers and a woman. And they were publicly executed by burning to death. For what? Because they taught their children the Lord's Prayer in English. Now that's remarkable when you realize that something significant happened only 2 years before that in Cambridge. It was during the persecution of those days by the leading religious authorities against any expression of religion in any other language except Latin that a young man named Thomas Bilney used to walk these streets in Cambridge. He had been soundly converted to Christ by reading the Greek New Testament of Erasmus, and immediately trying to share his faith had gone to the White Horse Inn where the sophists of his generation used to meet. It was the Mars Hill. The end result of his meeting there was that many of the leading professors at Cambridge University here were being converted to Christ. That immediately attracted attention. And among the people that came from different parts of England to this university was a young man named William Tyndale. He was an excellent Greek scholar. In fact, he was so well versed with 7 different languages that no stranger could determine which one was his native tongue. And he was a very committed man. In an argument one day, his debater said, "We had better be without God's law than the Pope's." Tyndale fired back at his opponent, "I defy the Pope and all his laws. And if God spare me, I will one day make the boy that drives the plough in England to know more of the Scripture than the Pope does." These are the fields on which Tyndale watched commoners ploughing constantly. They're situated on the Cotswold Hills, and that is the Severn Valley. It's little Sodbury Manor, owned in those days by Sir John Walsh. Walsh lived here with his wife and his 2 boys, and Tyndale was hired to become the tutor of those 2 boys. This little attic room happens to be the private room of William Tyndale while he worked for the Walsh family. Here he slept, and here he kept his books, and here he studied. The idea came to him that if the Greek New Testament had such a profound effect upon the scholastic world, what would an English Bible do for ploughboys? At this very spot, he decided he was going to translate the Greek New Testament into English. He worked on the project while he was here for 6 months. Then he realized that it was jeopardizing the Walsh family's life. So he left here and he went to London. He tried to get the Bishop of London, Bishop Tunstall, to give him official permission for what he was doing. But Tunstall would not do it. So he self-imposed an exile on himself, went over to the continent, met with Martin Luther, and found a great friend in Luther. He finished the work of translation and then started on the problem of having it printed. That was a very difficult problem for him to solve, because the English had decided they were going to do everything to make it impossible. They put a price on his head. And so he lived in poverty.